Denmark, the United States is here, Latin America is down here. So all these countries are actually pretty far to the side on self-expression values compared to survival values, but they vary along this vertical dimension because Scandinavia is very secular, rational, whereas America and Latin America are much more religious. Of course, if you took just San Francisco and New York and Cambridge, they'd be up there with Sweden, and the rest of the country would be there, which is important for our story. But here's what I think is so interesting about this map. When I really got into it a couple years ago, as I'm trying to write a book on capitalism and morality, what I come to see is so interesting is that all the countries down here are poor, of course. So traditional survival values are what the values you have when you can't count on there being food in a couple months and you need to have strong local alliances and kinship systems. So all the countries down here are poor. These are especially the Muslim countries and the African countries. All the countries up there are rich. That's Protestant Europe. So you might think that it goes like this. Agricultural societies are like this, but as they get richer, they move up that way. That would be a common sense thought, but that's not what they find. The people who run the World Values Survey find that a general trajectory is more like this. Agricultural societies have values down here, but when they make the transition from agriculture to industry, and they have to now fit with the machines, not the cycle of the seasons that take rituals to bring the rain, but now you have to fit with the machine schedule. So you develop more secular, rational values. This, I think, is what Karl Marx saw in London when he saw the early industrial revolution in Manchester. Is that everybody was just going for money. It was ugly, the loss of traditional ways, but it was just very materialistic. So you get these materialistic values up here. But then after a few generations, their grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren join the service economy. And for the service economy, you have to have people skills. You have to be able to work with people, persuade people, sell to people. So the general trajectory is actually like this, which is very, very interesting. You can see this happening if you look at the Confucian countries. So here's China, Taiwan, South Korea. And here's Japan. Now, of course, Japan is in a league of its own. Japan was the first non-Western country, not by a little bit, but by many, many decades. Japan industrialized very quickly, and sure enough, Japan is 2 or 3 generations closer to Sweden than is China, Korea, or Taiwan. I'm not saying they're going to end up at Sweden, but they might. We don't know. They're on the way. So this is what's been happening to values as we get richer and safer. And here's the quote. Here's the really important quote that really just, I practically have this pinned to my wall as I think about cross-national psychology. From this book by Christian Welzel, who's one of the people who runs the World Values Survey, they say, fading existential pressures, that is, when you no longer have to worry about there being food in a few months, when you no longer have to worry about your kids being dead in a year, fading existential pressures open people's minds, making them prioritize freedom over security, autonomy over authority, diversity over uniformity, and creativity over discipline. Well, that sounds great, right? That sounds like progress. That sounds like us in this room. That's what we are. That's what we value. And this is especially common in the cosmopolitan elite, that you get a new moral worldview. You get globalism. Let me show you. Oh, here's the globalist anthem. If you ever get confused as to what we believe, and again, I'm doing this in quotes because we don't know, but what the globalists believe, just go to this. Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. If we could just get rid of all that stuff, we'd all live together in peace, right? We'd all live as one. That's the globalist dream. Let me show you some data. Here's what globalists believe. So I run a research site at yourmorals.org. You can go there, take a bunch of surveys, learn about your moral values and things like that. One survey we have up there is called the Identification with All Humanity Scale. It's got questions like this. How much would you say you care, that is, feel upset, want to help, how much would you say you care when bad things happen to people in my community, my country, or people anywhere in the world, on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, whatever it is? How much? How close do you feel to people in those 3 groups? How often do you use the word we to refer to? So these are the sorts of things Joe was saying. It's not cooperation versus non-cooperation. It's the sort of the local versus the local personal versus the more global impersonal. Here's the data. When people come to the site, they register and they say whether they're very conservative, very liberal, progressive. And so people who say that they're very conservative are parochial. That is, they say we more often for people in their community or country than for people elsewhere in the world. Okay, that's a definition of parochial. There's nothing wrong with it. It's kind of sensible and rational. So people who are conservatives are nationalists. They care more about people in their country than people far away. People who are moderate are not nationalists. They care equally about everybody. You could make a case for that. But how can you make a case for this? How can you make a logical, rational, moral, or philosophical case that you should care more, use the word we more, et cetera, for people in the world in general than people in your community or country? What can that even mean? It means you're a new kind of person. It means your mind has been changed. You're a globalist. You might not even like your country, especially if your country is not in Scandinavia. So to summarize chapter 1, a set of innovations that first came together in Europe, and here I mean democratic capitalism, banking, trade, all the corporate law, all the things that came together to create that gigantic upsurge in wealth and prosperity, gave us these wonderful, peaceful societies, peace and prosperity then change values, minds, and cultures. We get a new kind of person, a globalist, cosmopolitan, what David Goodhart calls an anywhere versus a somewhere. We're all anywheres in this room. It doesn't. We can be from anywhere, and you can plunk us down anywhere. So that's chapter 1. The others will go faster. Because what happens when you get such a society? Lots and lots of people want to move there. So for as long as we have records, when there's hunger in one place and food in another, people want to move there. They're hungry, they go where the food or the possibilities of prosperity are. It was true in the Bible, it's true, this is Irish immigrants departing Liverpool for North America, and this is the percent foreign born in the United States. In the late 19th century, it was very, very high. Then there were immigration restrictions. It becomes very, very low in the late 20th century, and then those restrictions were lifted in the 60s, and now it's much higher. So we have another peak in percentage foreign born in the United States. Same thing is happening in Europe. Much more recently, this is the map from 2 years ago. This is from immigration in 2015 as a result of the various of ISIS spreading throughout the Middle East, of the war in Syria, hunger, people, especially a few years ago, long lines of people walking to Europe. And Germany, of course, famously opened its arms, opened its gates, and took in an enormous number of immigrants from Middle Eastern countries. This is the total European. This is the part that went to Germany. And what did it do? A gigantic left-right split. On the left, this is wonderful movie stars, Susan Sarandon, somehow she's out there just as they're arriving, and amazingly, there was a photographer there who actually caught the moment that,
Not a selfie.
yeah. And I'll skip this quote, but the point is that globalists generally believe that patriotism is racism. Patriotism is a bad thing. Nationalists, in contrast, are patriotic, and they really, really hate the anti-patriotism of the globalists. So this is why you get the constant battles, not just in America, but in France and Sweden and Denmark. You get them everywhere, all over Europe, over burkinis, over clothing. In Sweden, they implemented gendered swimming hours, which is very contrary to Sweden's gender equality norms. A poll on a conservative website, a poll found that a majority of Americans don't want to press 1 for English. Please tell me more about how you came to our country and now want us to change our traditions because they offend you. So there's a lot of resentment by the nationalists for the globalists. So summarizing this chapter, once you get this amazing wealth, opportunity, cosmopolitan values, it not just attracts immigration, but it welcomes it, which sets up a conflict with the nationalists. So chapter 3, the authoritarian alarm. Here I really recommend to you work by Karen Stenner. She's a political scientist, wrote this wonderful book in 2005, The Authoritarian Dynamic, and then she kind of dropped out of the academic world for a while, and while the academic world or the political world came around to basically exemplify everything she said in this book. What she says is that authoritarianism is not, we know that these things go together. People who are morally, politically, and racially intolerant. Those things go together. What Stenner shows us is that it's not a stable trait. It's not that some people have that and others don't. It's a predisposition. Some people have a personality that is like that only when they perceive normative threat, that is, a threat to the moral order. The three major forms of normative threat are disobedience to group authorities, if there's widespread insurrections, nonconformity to group norms, lack of consensus in group values, the sense of diversity run amok. That's a good way to really activate the authoritarians and push them into political activity to oppose you. This is exactly what Richard Nixon did. This was his playbook in 1968 with the chaos in the streets, and it worked for him. Donald Trump literally copied, Paul Manafort admitted that they actually looked back at Nixon's speeches to model Donald Trump's acceptance speech. The crime and violence that today afflicts our nation, even though it has the lowest crime rate in decades, will soon come to an end, begin, etc. So he didn't say the part about I put that in. And it's happening in Scandinavia, too. It's happening in a lot of countries where there is high levels of Muslim immigration and group organizations on the right that want to call attention to this. And so there's often a backlash against immigrants since 2015, 2016. So that's chapter 3. All populations contain multiple personality types. There's always some possibility of normative threat. And when this happens, we get this reaction. But I want to note, the reaction is not selfish. It's groupish. It's tribal. This is what a tribal ape does. A tribal ape that wants trade, wants exposure, can do openness, but is pretty quick to slam the gates down under certain circumstances. Chapter 4, what now? Stenner gives us, I think, a really important piece of advice here. She says, we can best limit intolerance of difference by parading, talking about, and applauding our sameness. Ultimately, nothing inspires greater tolerance from the intolerant than an abundance of common and unifying beliefs, practices, rituals, institutions, and processes. This is essentially what Joe said pretty much this in one of his slides. You have the ethnic psychology, the kinship psychology, the shared norms. There's all sorts of things you can do to create this large society. But if you don't do any of them, good luck. And regrettably, nothing is more certain to provoke increased expression of the latent predispositions of authoritarianism than the likes of multicultural education, bilingual policies, and non-assimilation. So to sum this all up, if you think about small-scale societies are very solid and stable, built on these psychological foundations Joe told you about. And then we found ways to create these gigantic accumulations of people, and we can do these gigantic societies, but they're always subject to centripetal forces blowing it out, and centrifugal forces are the ones pulling it out, and centripetal forces pulling us in. You have to pay attention to the balance between them. And if society has a surplus of centrifugal force and very weak centripetal forces, what do you think is going to happen? So if you have a very large country with linguistic diversity, a short history, has cultural or religious diversity, high levels of immigration, especially from parts of that map I showed you that are very different. So not Norwegians living in Stockholm, but people from the Middle East moving to Stockholm. If you have high levels of that, it's fine to have low levels. If you have high levels, it's going to be a centrifugal force. And if you have conflict within the nation, as we do in this country, you've got very strong forces there. So just a little framework to organize our thoughts and our discussion about this. Since 2016, I think more and more people are beginning to recognize that the EU project was at least insufficiently aware of these psychological processes. As Donald Tusk said, it is us who today are responsible. Obsessed with the idea of instant and total integration, we fail to notice that ordinary people, the citizens of Europe, do not share our Euro enthusiasm. So what now? I think the globalists need to at least understand their compatriots. It can never hurt to understand. Patriotism is not the same thing as racism, and there are healthy forms of patriotism and even nationalism. There are malignant forms too. And I think that immigration, we really need to talk openly about immigration. It's very hard to talk about because of the nature, the political forces at work on professors, on the academy, on researchers. But mass immigration has mixed effects. It has, the economists tell us it's generally good. I totally believe that. But it has a variety of effects for social cohesion and trust. And we need to at least consider what kind of immigration policies would have the best ratio of good to bad effects. So that is my talk. These are the 4 chapters of the story of how we got to where we are now. I'll leave you with just, again, to come back to this, that clearly we can do large-scale liberal democracies. We've done it, but there may be a very small margin of error, and we might be outside of that margin. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Mit